All right, hey, it's Sean McGeever, and I'm going to do a Talk Tuesday. It's Sunday. I've been really busy once again. Sorry about that, but I'm really excited to talk about Matthew 15. So, what I've been doing is going through the odd chapters of Matthew here in the fall and the spring. We're going to go through the evening chapters to go through the gospel to talk about how you might approach talking through this chapter for a Young Life or Wildlife or a Capernaum or Young Lives Club Talk. So here are a couple ideas about Matthew 15. Now, first of all, if you're just to look at Matthew chapter 15, you'll see that there's a couple different stories. There are at least four. First off, the first story would be that there is this Jesus' interaction with those who are clean and unclean. There's a second story about Jesus and the Canaanite woman, the faith of the Canaanite woman. There's a third story that you could cover, which is about Jesus healing Gentiles, and I'll go into more about that in a moment. And then there's a fourth story where you could talk about Jesus feeding the 4,000. I think that if you're just choose one of those four, I would go with the fourth one, Jesus feeding the 4,000. But I'm actually going to talk about how you might be able to combine the third one and the fourth one, Jesus' healing of the Gentiles, and then his feeding of the 4,000, who happened to actually be the 4,000 Gentiles. Now, one important detail, just because we're going through the odd chapters right now, there's an important detail about Jesus feeding the 4,000 in Matthew 15 that we missed because we didn't talk about Matthew 14, which is in Matthew 14, that is where Jesus heals the 5,000. So in Matthew 14, it goes from feeding 5,000, and then in Matthew 15, it goes to feeding 4,000, and that's relevant, and I'll bring it up when we come to it, why that's important. So just in a nutshell, if I was to go through it, I would highlight two of the stories. First off, that Jesus, in the healing part, I would say Jesus is a healer and a racial radical. He steps across those boundaries of racial and cultural background. One, he healed the lame, the blind, the crippled, and the mute, and others. And he did this all in a Gentile area where it was people from a different culture and background than him. And then second, Jesus is a miracle worker, and people really quickly forget who he is if they knew who he was before. So you could call it like spiritual amnesia or Christian amnesia or something like that. It's from Dale Bruner. I thought that was a good way to put it. People are hungry, disciples forget about Jesus' power, and yet Jesus still says, I'll work again. It doesn't matter. If you aren't remembering who I am, I'll show you who I am all over again. And so those are just kind of a big picture outline. A couple main points that you could go through in this passage is that Jesus is a bold God who is not put off by who you are or what you're like or your background in any way. That could be one of your main points. Basically an invitation to say Jesus goes into all that and invites all of us. A second main point might be that Jesus is able to heal and to make things out of nothing. I know it might just sound like super obvious, but Jesus is not a normal human. He has these capacities and that show that he's God. Third, that we like the disciples who even when they had Jesus in their midst, they try to figure out how to solve their own problems. Well, probably, yeah, we try to find our own solve our own problems all the time without turning to Jesus and knowing what he's able to do. And fourth, where do you turn when you are your resources are exhausted in life? So a couple different angles that you could take on this. And here are four things that you could talk about or highlight about Jesus. First off, Jesus is not just a mere man. He is God, and that he can heal and that he can do miracles. Verse 30 and verse 35 through 37. Second, Jesus is willing to cut across the cultural and societal norms. His interactions in both of those parts were with Gentiles in the Jewish area. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Third, that Jesus still does miraculous deeds, even though the disciples constantly forget what he's capable of. It had just been right before where Jesus had fed 5,000. It had been just right before where Jesus had healed all these people, and yet still the disciples totally forget. Jesus still acts even when we are forgetful. And then a fourth point that you could make about Jesus is that at least 4,000 people, and that was just men, so maybe like 8 or 10,000 people, just in this instance, were able to know about Jesus' miraculous abilities. Lots of people heard about Jesus and actually were a part of that miracle. Just imagine the rumors and the stories that kept going out because of the 10,000 people who saw this happen. What might this have to do with our life? Here's a couple things. I have three of them. First off, imagine a mute speaking, the crippled made well, the lame walking, the blind seeing. This is a powerful image, and it shows that Jesus is not merely a human, though he is human, but also fully God. A second is, what does this have to do with my life? Well, if you consider yourself an outsider in any way, maybe because of how you act or what you wear or who you are, or where you're from or what you believe or don't believe, these are not barriers for Jesus. He is eager to go beyond all of those and to be right where you're at. You don't need to qualify. You don't need to be on the inner circle. He is completely committed to walking into all that. Just like he said, I'll go to right where the Gentiles are at. And third, what does this have to do with life? You know, a lot of us get kind of spiritual amnesia. Now, there'll be people in the crowd who are Christians. There'll be some that aren't Christians. But, you know, here's the thing. It'd be a good reminder for those who are Christians, or maybe a heads up for those that, Lord willing, might be a Christian one day, that we can easily go from knowing all about God and his capacities and what he's able to do, and then we forget about him. Like, it's just a temptation that we all face. So Jesus amnesia. Jesus had just fed 5,000, healed all these people. They don't put two to two together and realize that he can also help feed the 4,000. Here's a couple relevant technical details. First off, in verse 29, it talks about that Jesus is going by the Sea of Galilee, and this is one of the details where we know that Jesus is where the Gentiles are at. That, and then also in verse 31, because it says they praise the God of Israel. You would only say something like that if that wasn't kind of like art. You would have said something like, and we praise the Lord. They said, no, we praise the God of Israel. So we know from geography, but also the phrase that is in there, that the people who were in the region where Jesus was at were not Jewish, and therefore they were unclean. They were foreigners and thought of as pagans, which was anyone who wasn't Jewish technically. And in today's terms, this could be thought of as being in a racial and religious foreign land. So another technical detail, not super technical, but I think it's always important in a good club talk to talk about any word that you go, someone walking through the door for the first time go, I don't really know what that is. We don't normally use that word. And one of those words is disciples. And I almost always just say, when the word disciples comes up, I just say Jesus' closest friends. Another one, this one might not work into a club talk per se, but in verse 36 where it says that Jesus gave thanks, this probably doesn't work into a club talk at all, but it's the word for Thanksgiving. It's the word that we use for communion, Eucharist, and it's a bit of a heads up. It's actually pretty powerful that before the Last Supper, where Jesus shared communion, the Eucharist, with his disciples, he actually shared it with thousands of Gentiles too, in a way. So he stopped and gave thanks. That's not just me saying that. That's what, something that scholars have said. This is really a significant thing, that Jesus was willing to share a meal like this with that many people who weren't in his normal kind of crowd. Also in verse 37, where it uses in some translation, it says something like they all ate and were satisfied. This is when they passed around all the food. It says that they are satisfied. Well, that word there is actually a really cool one, where it means that they were completely filled so that they weren't hungry anymore. They were really, really full, and maybe even a better word would be something like that they were stuffed. Like all you can eat buffet, they're like, I can't take anymore. The idea is you wouldn't want any more food. That's how much they were eating. So that says something about the types of resources that Jesus has to fill us. And then in verse 38, where it says 4,000 besides women and children, well, Matthew spells it out pretty clearly. It wasn't 4,000. Who knows? I mean, it's just a guess, but maybe 8,000 if everyone brought, maybe a spouse or a sibling. Or maybe a sister or something, maybe children, who knows? We don't really know, but certainly wasn't 4,000. It was, I don't know, maybe 10,000 is quite a few people. Just wrapping it up here, and this is kind of the end, a couple possible illustrations. I think it would be really powerful to bring, if you're talking about how Jesus healed those people, bring the disabilities to life. So if you're talking about that people were blind, I always think, well, let's just turn off the lights and talk about what it would be like to go through life like that. If I thought about this for a little bit, what would it be like to be mute, where you weren't able to talk? Maybe from up front you say, I want you to experience for a moment how just a little glimpse of what it would be like if you couldn't speak, and then just stop talking. I mean, it might sound bizarre, but honestly, if you were to stop talking for 10 seconds even, it doesn't sound like that long. It would get awkward. Maybe you go 15 seconds, 30 seconds. Then when you break it, you go, what was that like? Did that feel awkward to you? Imagine your entire life being like that. So just trying to bring a little bit, just a small glimpse of what it might be like to have, have these disabilities. Or lame, just sit on the ground and talk, or just sit on the ground and don't move at all. Maybe lay flat, or on your side or something, and just say, imagine if this is all you could do for your entire life. Anyway, just in a bunch of different ways you could highlight the disabilities that they had and what it would have meant for Jesus to step into those. So you can turn the lights on, you can begin speaking again, you could stand up after a while, and that could illustrate the sorts of transformation that Jesus can do in people's lives. Another one is that you could talk about the racial, social, or cultural lessons that you've needed to learn and lessons that you've learned along the way that where you've had to change. Now, this would take some transparency, and it also just has to be true. But if you've ever had someone cross one of those barriers, like a racial or a cultural or social barrier to step into your life, or if you've had to do that for someone else, you could talk about that. But the point wouldn't be to talk about maybe how hard your life is, though that can also be true, and you certainly can talk about that. The point for a club talk would be that we want to talk about Jesus, and that Jesus went immediately beyond all of these and cared for people. So you could just talk about how much of a blessing or how much of a challenge it was for your own experience with that, and just to say, Jesus was absolutely willing to do this. He didn't even flinch and stepped right into that. And last, it's kind of the most obvious one for illustrations. I always look for what's the stuff that you could touch or hold from the passage itself. And in this one, there's the loaves of bread and the fish. And I would say you could go and bring 7 loaves of bread, bring them into your club talk, or maybe 7 rolls. Maybe that would be a little bit easier. And a few fish, but I don't know if I'd bring fish in because they're stinky. I just don't like fish either. But maybe you bring in some goldfish, a box of goldfish, or maybe some Swedish fish. Maybe they would like that, and pass those around and have everyone touch something, a piece of bread, some sort of fish thing, and just show that Jesus did a miracle. Everyone was full. They were satisfied. They were stuffed. You could even bring it around a basket to do it. Now, it might seem, that certainly would be a home run with Wyldlife, but I think it could go even further than you might imagine with high school kids too. So I hope it gives you something to think about for this club talk in Matthew 15. I'm hoping your ideas are a lot better than mine, and maybe you could talk about it with leaders that you know too to go even further. But hopefully that's helpful, and I hope you have a great day. All right, bye.